What the hell happens when a black CEO is publicly humiliated at the very charity gala she's bankrolling? What happens when the bitchy, old money hostess has no damn idea she's mocking the one woman who holds a $900 million leash on her entire empire? You're about to find out. Before we dive into this insane story of karmic justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of what happens next. And let me know in the comments, what's the most brazen act of disrespect you've ever witnessed? You might find it pales in comparison to this. The Grand Ballroom of the St. Regis in Chicago was a cathedral of inherited wealth. Chandeliers, heavy with 1,000 teardrops of crystal, dripped light across Italian marble floors. Polished to such a sheen, they mirrored the constellations of diamonds on the necks of the women below. The walls were draped in deep crimson velvet, absorbing the sound of a string quartet that floated like silk above the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. The air, thick and sweet, was perfumed with thousands of white roses flown in from Ecuador that very morning. Every single detail didn't just whisper, it screamed tradition, legacy, and the kind of power that never has to introduce itself. This was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, an event so entrenched in the city's high society, it was older than most of the fortunes in the room. It was a night where reputations were cemented in gold, and fortunes were flaunted like peacock feathers. At the epicenter of this opulent universe stood Victoria Sterling, the hostess. At 45, she was the walking, talking embodiment of old money entitlement, a woman who believed her last name was a hall pass for life. Her gown was a shimmering column of molten gold sequins, a dress designed to be seen from space. Her blonde hair was piled high in an elaborate chignon that looked less like a hairstyle and more like a crown. Victoria had been marinated since birth in the belief that the Sterling name was synonymous with authority, a divine right to rule over this little kingdom of charity and influence. Tonight was her stage, and every guest in attendance, from tech billionaires to political dynasties, was her captive audience. Imani Wallace, at 42, moved through this world with a different kind of gravity. Her gown was black silk, a masterpiece of quiet elegance that clung to her frame with tailored precision, but was utterly devoid of unnecessary sparkle. She didn't need sequins to command a room. She carried herself with the profound calm of a person who had learned long ago that true presence is far louder than any spectacle. Her hair was cut into a sharp, stylish bob that framed a face of intelligent beauty. Her jewelry minimal, a single, perfect diamond stud at each ear and a watch whose value could have funded a small nation. She stood near a second-row table, an island of stillness in a sea of frantic networking. She was content to remain unnoticed, because being underestimated was a currency she had mastered, a tool she knew precisely how to wield. Victoria, a creature of pure pageantry, gripped the microphone with a practiced ease, her voice amplified and sharp, ringing across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, darlings," she cooed, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds on her wrist. "Before we begin the very serious business of our pledges, let's have a little celebration, shall we?" Her eyes glittered with a predatory mischief as two uniformed staff members wheeled in a towering 7-tier cake. Each layer was frosted in immaculate white buttercream and decorated with a cascade of spun sugar roses that spiraled upward like a staircase to heaven. A collective gasp of admiration filled the room. The cake was meant to symbolize abundance, generosity, the very heart of the foundation. But in Victoria's hands, it was about to become a weapon. She scanned the room, her gaze as sharp as a shard of glass, searching not for a friend, but for a target. It was a cruel little game she liked to play, a way to remind everyone who was in charge. Her eyes landed on Imani Wallace. Perhaps it was the stark simplicity of her gown, in a room screaming for attention. Perhaps it was the absence of a recognizable society name on her place card, which simply read, Guest. Or perhaps it was an arrogance so profound, so deeply ingrained that it required no reason at all. Victoria's smile sharpened into a weapon. "You there?" she called out, her voice slicing through the polite chatter. "In the black dress. Yes, you. Step forward, please." A hush fell over the ballroom. Conversations died mid-sentence. Hundreds of heads swiveled in unison. Imani did not flinch. She placed her champagne flute on a passing tray and walked toward the stage with the same quiet, unhurried composure she had carried all evening. The soft tap, tap, tap of her heels against the marble was like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an event no one could yet comprehend. The guests leaned forward, a wave of curiosity and nervous anticipation rippling through them. They smelled drama, the only thing more intoxicating than the vintage champagne they were drinking. Victoria gestured extravagantly toward the pristine, towering cake. "Every gala needs a blessing before the feast," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sweetness. "And tradition," she paused for effect, "demands that those who serve our community offer the first gesture." The phrasing was deliberate, a poisoned dart wrapped in velvet. "Serve." The word hung in the air, thick with insinuation. A ripple of uncomfortable, nervous laughter ran through the front tables, the people who understood the code. Imani stopped just before the low platform, the cake looming beside her, taller than her shoulders. She looked at Victoria, her expression unreadable. Victoria leaned closer, her smile stretched unnaturally wide, a rictus of manufactured charm. "Every gala needs a little drama," she whispered, just loud enough for the microphone to catch the sibilant hiss of her words. And then, with a sudden, violent shove, she pushed the entire 7-tier cake forward. The impact was an explosion of white. Frosting and sponge collided with Imani's body. The rich scent of vanilla and buttercream filled the air as the pristine structure disintegrated. White frosting smeared across Imani's face, blinding her for a second. Her exquisite black silk gown, a custom piece of couture, was drenched, ruined, plastered with chunks of cake and sugar roses. The towering confection toppled in sections across the stage and floor, splattering the expensive shoes and silk tablecloths of the nearest guests. Gasps of genuine shock erupted from the crowd, quickly followed by loud, braying bursts of laughter from the darker corners of the room, from men drunk on champagne and cruelty. Phones, like 100 tiny predators, shot into the air, their lenses glowing as they recorded every single humiliating detail. Victoria threw her head back and laughed, a shrill, brittle sound amplified by the microphone. "Oh, come now, everyone!" she shrieked, desperate to frame the assault as a playful prank. "It's only cake! Surely we can all laugh at ourselves!" Her laughter was sharp, desperate, a frantic attempt to control the narrative, to command the room's reaction. For a moment, a single, stretched-out second, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The entire ballroom was a tableau of shock, confusion, and ugly mirth. But Imani Wallace did not. She raised her hands, not to strike, not to gesture in anger, but to slowly, deliberately wipe the thick frosting from her eyes. Her movements were calm, precise. She looked neither angry nor broken. Wiping the cream from her cheek, she straightened her back, turned to face the hundreds of staring faces, and held her gaze steady. In that moment, covered in the ruins of a 7-tier cake, she looked more regal than the woman in the sequined crown. The room stilled. The energy shifted so palpably it felt like a drop in barometric pressure. Conversations died. laughter caught in throats, turning into choked coughs. Even the string quartet, halfway through a Vivaldi piece, let their bows fall silent, their uncertainty mirroring the room's. Imani did not speak. She did not need to. The silence she commanded was heavier, more powerful, than any outburst could have ever been. It pressed down on the room, a physical weight, forcing each guest to confront their own complicity, their own unease. The laughter had been ugly, but this silence was terrifying. Near the bar, a hedge fund manager whispered urgently to his companion, his face suddenly pale. "Do you have any idea who that is?" His friend frowned, scrolling frantically on his phone. "She looks familiar, I can't place her." The answer came from a woman nearby, clutching the pearls at her throat as if to keep them from shattering. "That," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly, "is Imani Wallace. She's the CEO of Meridian Global Capital." The man's jaw dropped. The woman continued, the words tumbling out in a horrified whisper. "She controls over $900 million in private equity commitments. My husband's firm has been trying to get a meeting with her for a year." The whisper, that name, that number, spread like fire through dry grass. Imani Wallace, Meridian Global, 900 million. Phones buzzed under tables as guests frantically Googled the name. Faces, moments ago flush with amusement, turned ashen. They were realizing, in real time, the catastrophic mistake Victoria Sterling had just made. Victoria herself, too drunk on her own bravado and the sound of her own voice, hadn't noticed. She tapped the microphone, trying to recapture the moment. "Now then," she chirped, her smile frozen in place. "Let's continue with those pledges, shall we?" But the pledges never came. The money was forgotten. The energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. Every eye followed Imani as she turned from the wreckage of the cake, calmly handed a soiled napkin to a stunned server, accepted a glass of water from another, and walked back to her seat. Her poise was an impenetrable shield, untouched by frosting or humiliation. The hall, in some invisible, psychic way, bent toward her. Respect, real and profound, was drawn to her like iron filings to a magnet. Victoria's laughter finally faltered. She could feel it now, the cold dread creeping in. She sensed something slipping, something vital shifting beyond her control, but she couldn't understand what it was. Her smile became too bright, her voice too high, a desperate parody of her earlier confidence. The few half-hearted chuckles her guests gave in return were the sounds of an empire beginning to crumble. The videos hit the internet before the first guests had even called for their cars. The first TikTok clip, shaky and raw, garnered 50,000 views in under 10 minutes. By the end of the first hour, hashtags erupted across Twitter and Instagram. Tuxer Cakegate. Dignity over dessert. Respect is wealth. Comments poured in by the thousands. Imagine humiliating someone without realizing she funds your entire gala. Another wrote, "She didn't even blink. That's not composure. That's a damn superpower. Queen energy. And the most prescient one of all, this is going to cost millions, but millions was a pathetic understatement." Back in the ballroom, Imani sat quietly at her table, dabbing the last streak of frosting from her cheek with a fresh napkin. She didn't shout. She didn't leave. She didn't even frown. And that terrifying restraint made the very air in the room vibrate with tension. Every guest who had laughed now stared at their shoes, drowning in shame. Those who had gasped now held their breath, terrified of what would come next. The hostess who thought she owned the night had no idea the night no longer belonged to her. Because Imani Wallace, the woman she had treated like a nameless, faceless servant, was the one who held $900 million of her empire in the palm of her hand. And when she finally chose to close that hand, The entire system Victoria Sterling thought she ruled would come crashing down around her. The frosting was still drying on the polished marble floor when the first video hit 1 million views. The clip was short, shaky, and absolutely merciless. It showed Victoria Sterling, head thrown back, laughing into a microphone while Imani Wallace stood covered in cake, silent, poised, and impossibly regal. The crowd's uneasy laughter, the chilling silence that followed, the palpable shift in the air, it was all there, captured in 15 seconds of viral dynamite. And in those 15 seconds, Victoria Sterling's empire had begun to fracture. By the time the gala officially ended, the cavernous ballroom was a ghost town of half-empty glasses and whispered apologies. Guests were glued to their phones, their faces illuminated by the horrifying glow of their own screens. Some scrolled in disbelief as comments piled up beneath the video by the tens of thousands. How dare she treat anyone like that? This is old money rot. Others, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, tried to backpedal, rushing to Imani's side to offer hushed, frantic apologies on her way out. Apologies she accepted with a single, graceful nod. But no words. Words were unnecessary now. She left the ballroom with her head held high, her gown ruined, but her dignity a fortress. Victoria remained on the stage, her frozen smile a mask of denial, pretending nothing had changed. But the world had already changed around her. Within the hour, TikTok creators had remixed the clip with captions. She stayed silent because power doesn't need to shout. Another version set the video to a dramatic, swelling orchestral piece, cutting between Victoria's aggressive shove and Imani's composed, steady stare. That remix crossed 5 million views before the sun rose over Lake Michigan. On Twitter, the hashtags bloomed into a global conversation. Sterling Cakegate, Respect is the New Currency, and simply, Imani Wallace. LinkedIn, the platform of the corporate world, erupted with commentary from executives, CEOs, and venture capitalists. This is a masterclass in why emotional intelligence in leadership matters. Another post read, "Implicit bias will cost you billions." Literally. On Instagram, stories were filled with screenshots of Imani's calm, frosting-smeared expression, paired with a single caption, "Queen." At her penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Imani sat in a plush armchair, wrapped in a silk robe, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in her hands. She had scrolled through the firestorm on her phone only once before setting it aside. Her longtime advisor and confidant, David, leaned against the marble fireplace, his own phone buzzing non-stop like an angry hornet. "It's everywhere," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. CNN, BBC, Forbes, even Al Jazeera, they're calling it the cake incident. Some of them have already figured it out, Imani. They're naming you as the target. Imani took a slow sip of her tea, her voice as steady and calm as it had been in the ballroom. They think the story is about a cake, David. Soon, they will understand it is about capital. At the Sterling Foundation headquarters, where Victoria's Family Foundation shared trustees with some of the city's most powerful financial institutions, the first waves of panic began to ripple outward. Bankers started calling at dawn, asking if Meridian Global Capital, the quiet, multi-billion-dollar giant behind so many of the Sterling Foundation's flagship projects, was pulling out. Emails multiplied by the minute, their subject lines filled with nervous questions. Victoria, when she finally surfaced after a champagne-fueled sleep, brushed them off with a wave of her hand. "It was just a joke," she snapped to her board chair over the phone. "Everyone needs to lighten up. It'll blow over in a day." But the board wasn't laughing. They had seen the same clip the rest of the world had seen. They had felt that chilling shift in the room, the way the laughter died, the way a powerful, unnerving silence took command. They knew something Victoria, in her bubble of inherited arrogance, did not. Silence like that doesn't mean a story is ending. It means power is gathering. We're about to see the whole damn system start to crumble, and if you're enjoying this story of a queen dismantling an empire with nothing but silence, show some love and smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Now, back to the chaos. By noon the next day, the video had been viewed over 30 million times across all platforms. Celebrities, athletes, and public figures joined the chorus of condemnation and admiration. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "She didn't throw a punch. She didn't scream. She didn't need to. That's dignity." The post reached 2 million likes in under 6 hours. A retired NBA legend, known for his on-court composure, posted, "This is how you dismantle arrogance. Not with anger, but with unshakable composure." A Pulitzer Prize-winning author added a simple, devastating post on Instagram. "A $900 million lesson in respect." The cultural tide had turned into a tsunami, and Victoria was about to be swept away. She tried to laugh it off in a hastily arranged interview with a friendly morning show. She appeared on screen, smiling stiffly, her eyes betraying a hint of panic. "Oh, it was all in good fun?" she insisted, her voice a little too high. "We can't take ourselves so seriously all the time." The host, sensing the public mood, pressed her. "But do you regret shoving a cake into Ms. Wallace's face?" Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "Imani knows it was just a silly joke. We're old friends." The lie was so blatant, so easily disproven, that the clip of her denial spread even faster than the original cake video. The internet recoiled. Comments poured in. "She doesn't even apologize. She calls her Imani like they're friends. The delusion is staggering, and most ominously, she has no idea who Imani Wallace is. She has no idea what's coming. Here at Black Legacies, we tell these stories not because humiliation is rare, but because the aftermath of that humiliation can change the world." Back in her sprawling study, Imani Wallace read the latest reports from her team of analysts. David laid a sheaf of papers on her mahogany desk. "The numbers are clear," he said. "The Sterling Foundation depends on our capital commitments for almost half of its major projects, the full $900 million. Pulling that won't just hurt them, it will gut them. It will trigger default clauses with their other lenders." Imani looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, her own reflection steady in the glass. "Not yet," she said softly. "Let them show the world exactly who they are. Then," she turned back to David, her eyes holding a calm, cold fire, "we will show the world who we are." The viral spark was now a full-blown inferno. On Reddit, a thread titled, "The Cake That Cost $900 Million" shot to the front page. Thousands of users debated whether arrogance like Victoria's was an inevitable byproduct of generational wealth. People shared their own stories of being humiliated at work, dismissed at events, silenced in meetings. The hashtag, "I have been dismissed," trended globally. What had begun with a single, brutal cake smash had become a mirror in which millions of people recognized their own experiences of being belittled and overlooked. In university classrooms, business ethics professors replayed the video and asked their students, "What do you see here?" Some saw cruelty, others saw dignity. One professor told her MBA class, "You are witnessing the real-time financial cost of unchecked bias and disrespect." In churches and community centers, pastors and leaders referenced the clip in sermons about humility, grace, and the quiet power of restraint. The cultural weight of the moment grew heavier by the hour. Victoria's allies grew restless, then silent. Major donors began quietly pulling their support from upcoming Sterling galas, embarrassed to be associated with her name. Board members started whispering about resignations, trying to distance themselves from the impending implosion. A European bank, which had been in final negotiations for a new line of credit with the foundation, suddenly put the deal on an indefinite freeze. A Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund sent a curt, private message to the board. Reconsider your leadership, or you will lose our support entirely. For the first time, a sliver of genuine cold fear pierced Victoria's thick armor of denial. She tried to call Imani directly, but the number was blocked. She sent texts that went unanswered. Meanwhile, Imani moved with deliberate, surgical precision. She appeared in public only once that week, to attend a women's leadership summit where she was the keynote speaker. She gave a powerful speech about innovation and finance, and at the very end, without ever mentioning the gala, she added a single, resonant line. Respect is not optional. It is the price of entry into every room you wish to occupy. The room erupted in a standing ovation. That one line traveled the world in hours. Newspapers printed it as a headline. On Instagram, it became a beautifully designed graphic shared millions of times. In the aftermath, one journalist cornered Victoria outside a restaurant and asked if she felt she had underestimated Imani Wallace. Victoria, cornered and furious, sneered into the camera. "She's just another businesswoman with a chip on her shoulder. This will all pass." But it was already too late. The market, the public, the entire world had decided otherwise. Imani Wallace didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout or scream. The world was shouting for her. And when she finally made her move, it wouldn't just shake Victoria Sterling's good name. It would unravel every thread of the opulent, entitled world she thought she owned. The video had reached 50 million views by the time Victoria Sterling walked into her foundation's headquarters the following morning. She wore oversized Chanel sunglasses and a new Balenciaga power suit. Her chin tilted so high, it was a miracle she didn't trip. It was a posture meant to project defiance, a desperate attempt to erase the headlines with sheer force of will. Paparazzi shouted questions as she swept through the glass doors. "Mrs. Sterling, do you regret humiliating your largest donor? Is it true you're about to lose nearly $1 billion? Have you spoken to Imani Wallace?" Victoria kept walking, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She believed that if she ignored the noise long enough, the story would simply starve from lack of attention. But inside the building, the fire was already spreading. The boardroom, usually a bastion of smug confidence, was half full when she arrived. The directors who were present avoided her eyes, staring intently at their phones instead. A stack of newspapers lay on the polished mahogany table, and every single headline was brutal. The cake catastrophe. Billionaire bias. How arrogance cost a foundation its future. The $900 million reason respect matters. Victoria tossed her ridiculously expensive handbag onto a chair. "This is utterly ridiculous," she snapped, her voice echoing in the tense silence. One viral video does not dismantle a foundation with a century-long legacy. Eleanor Marsh, the foundation's unflappable CFO, and a woman who had served 3 generations of Sterlings, finally looked up at her. Her expression was even, almost cold. "Victoria, it isn't the video. It's the silence that followed it. She hasn't said a single word beyond one sentence at a summit, and that silence is methodically destroying us." Victoria scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She won't walk. She needs us. This gala funds her pet projects as much as ours." But even as she said the words, a worm of doubt squirmed in her gut. Her phone buzzed with another news alert. Meridian Global Capital, Imani's company, had quietly updated its website overnight. A single line of text had appeared in bold at the bottom of their homepage. All partnerships are subject to rigorous standards of dignity and equity. The phrase was subtle, corporate, and utterly devastating. It ricocheted through the financial press within minutes. Commentators debated whether it was a direct threat. Donors whispered about whether it was a final warning. To Victoria, it was still just background noise. She refused to believe, she was incapable of believing, that the woman she had so casually humiliated was capable of toppling her dynasty. Yet the cracks in her foundation were widening by the hour. That evening, Victoria appeared at a private reception intended to reassure her remaining high-level donors. Cameras were banned, but word of what happened leaked out almost instantly. She arrived forcing a brilliant smile, raising her glass high, pretending that the world wasn't burning down around her. But then, standing in a quiet corner of the room, speaking with the German ambassador, was Imani Wallace. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy suit, her expression placid, composed. Murmurs swept through the crowd like a virus. Guests whispered, "That's her." Others froze mid-sentence, their wine glasses paused halfway to their lips, waiting. Victoria's smile faltered when she saw her. The blood drained from her face. She hadn't expected Imani to show up, to walk directly into the lion's den. For a split second, she considered turning around and leaving, but a lifetime of pride glued her feet to the floor. She lifted her glass higher, a pathetic act of defiance, and called across the room, her voice tinged with a false saccharine warmth. "Ms. Wallace," she said, loudly enough to draw everyone's attention, "I do trust you've recovered from our little mishap." The word mishap hung in the air, hollow and insulting. The room stiffened. Every eye turned to Imani, waiting, desperate for her to finally break her strategic silence. Imani set her water glass down on a nearby table and walked slowly, deliberately toward Victoria. Every step she took seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. She stopped just close enough that her voice would carry, but her tone remained calm, almost conversational. "I don't consider public humiliation a mishap, Victoria," she said. Her words were not loud, but they cut through the room like a scalpel, sharp, precise, and controlled. "And I certainly don't confuse cruelty with tradition." Victoria forced a laugh, a desperate fluttering sound, trying to bat away the words. "Oh, you're taking this all far too seriously. It was a joke." Imani tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady and unblinking. $900 million, she said, her voice dropping a fraction, "is never a joke." The silence that followed was absolute. A banker at the back of the room nearly dropped his glass. A donor whispered the number to his wife, his face a mask of horror. $900 million? For the first time in public, Victoria's mask of supreme confidence cracked. Imani didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She let the number hang in the air like a thundercloud, pregnant with unspoken threat. It was the first public confirmation, the first direct revelation that the woman Victoria had mocked controlled the very lifeblood of her foundation. Victoria's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She sputtered, That's an exaggeration. You can't possibly mean—" But Imani's calm, unwavering, unflinching gaze silenced her. She simply turned, without another word, and walked out of the reception, leaving a vortex of whispers and panic swirling in her wake. The confrontation lasted less than a minute, but it shattered the remaining illusions. Donors fled the reception, their faces grim. Some called their lawyers from their cars, others called reporters. By morning, the Financial Times published a headline that confirmed what everyone now feared. Whitmore Foundation's largest backer threatens full withdrawal after public confrontation. Victoria raged at her staff. "Who leaked that? Who told them?" Eleanor replied coldly, not even looking up from her spreadsheet. "No one had to leak it, Victoria. She showed up. In this environment, that was enough." On Twitter, the clip of Victoria's morning show denial resurfaced, now spliced with headlines about Imani's $900 million leverage. The caption read, "She laughed at the cake. She forgot who pays for the candles." The post hit 10 million views in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, Imani remained a portrait of composure. In a quiet meeting with David and her senior advisors, she laid out the final numbers. "Our withdrawal will not only strip them of their primary funding source, it will trigger acceleration clauses in their bank loans. They've leveraged their entire operation against our commitment. Without it, the dominoes will fall." David asked, "Do you want to announce it now?" She shook her head. "No. Timing is power. Let them feel the ground shaking first." And the ground was shaking violently. By midweek, reporters were camped outside the Sterling Foundation's headquarters. The questions grew sharper, more pointed. "Ms. Sterling, is it true you mocked your largest and most vital donor? Will the $900 million be withdrawn?" Victoria dodged and weaved, insisting it was business as usual, but business was anything but usual. Staff whispered about mass layoffs. Long-term partners reconsidered joint projects. Even her own family members began to question her judgment. At a private family dinner, Victoria complained loudly, "This has all gone too far. She should be grateful she was even invited to the gala in the first place." A young cousin, horrified by her lack of remorse, recorded the rant on their phone. By the next morning, the audio had been leaked to a gossip blog. The public backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Comments poured in. She still hasn't learned a single thing. She doesn't realize she's already finished. Celebrities and public figures doubled down. A renowned actor tweeted, "Arrogance is smashing a cake in someone's face. Power is staying silent and letting the world choose a side." A famous tech entrepreneur posted on LinkedIn, "Let this be a lesson. $900 million isn't financial leverage, it's the byproduct of leadership." Victoria tried one last desperate attempt to seize control of the narrative. She scheduled a press conference, determined to end the speculation once and for all. She walked to the podium in a crisp white suit, a stark contrast to Imani's black dress, as cameras flashed like 1,000 tiny explosions. "I regret," she began, her voice tight, "that my actions have been misunderstood." The phrasing was fatal. Misunderstood. Not wrong, not cruel, not humiliating. Misunderstood. The reporters in the room pounced like sharks that smelled blood. "Do you acknowledge Imani Wallace's role as your major financial backer? Can you confirm whether she will withdraw her funds?" Victoria stammered, her carefully prepared words deserting her, a sheen of sweat visible under the bright lights. The footage went viral within minutes, spliced with laugh tracks and captions. She regrets nothing. She understands nothing. Back at Meridian Global, Imani watched the clip with her team. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply turned to David and said, "She still believes respect is optional. We will show her, and the world, that it is not." That evening, she attended a global finance summit in London, her appearance unannounced. When she stepped onto the stage to present an award, the entire audience of international bankers and finance ministers rose to their feet in a thunderous applause. She spoke with the same calm precision she always had. "Respect," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "is not courtesy, it is currency, and without it, no institution, no foundation, no empire can survive." Her words ricocheted around the globe. CNN ran the clip as breaking news. The BBC called it the Wallace Doctrine. Social media crowned it the quote of the year. Victoria watched it all from her penthouse apartment, her empire unraveling in real time on a dozen different screens. She finally screamed, a raw animal sound of pure rage and despair, and hurled her phone across the room, where it shattered against a marble wall. But no amount of broken glass could hide the truth. The woman she had dismissed in a flurry of frosting was now systematically dismantling her world with silence, with numbers, and with impeccable timing. And as Imani Wallace left the summit stage, engulfed by a sea of flashing cameras, one truth crystallized in the mind of every person watching. This confrontation was no longer about a cake. It was about control. And the woman Victoria Sterling had mocked now controlled everything. The boardroom of the Sterling Foundation had always been a temple of unshakable confidence. Long, imposing oak tables polished to a mirror gleam, portraits of past, stern-faced patrons lining the velvet walls, crystal water pitchers waiting at every seat. But on this morning, the temple felt like a tomb. Directors shuffled in quietly, their voices hushed, their faces grim. Their phones were buzzing with messages from their own bankers and lawyers, messages they did not want to answer. The stock market had not even opened in New York, and already the whispers of a complete and total collapse filled the air. Victoria Sterling swept into the room 10 minutes late, a pathetic attempt to project a sense of fashionably delayed confidence, as if that could disguise the sheer panic that was now gripping her world. She wore a scarlet suit, a screaming statement of defiance, but her eyes, wide and haunted, betrayed the tremor in her hands. She tossed her bag onto the table and barked, her voice brittle. "Let's get on with it. One viral clip does not undo a century of reputation." "Sure." But the faces staring back at her did not agree. They looked at her not as their leader, but as a ghost of leadership past, a liability that was about to sink them all. Eleanor Marsh, the CFO, broke the silence first. Her tone was no longer cold. It was surgical. "Victoria, it is not just a viral clip. It is the $900 million in funding tied to it. Ms. Wallace hinted at the number, and our creditors have confirmed it. If she pulls that capital, we are not just exposed. We are insolvent. The foundation ceases to exist." Victoria let out a sharp, forced laugh. "She wouldn't dare. She's blowing this completely out of proportion. It was cake, for God's sake." Another director, a man whose family had sat on this board for 50 years, shook his head slowly. "It was not the cake, Victoria. It was the contempt, and the entire world saw it." As if on cue, phones around the table buzzed again, almost in perfect unison. News alerts lit up the dark room. The Financial Times was reporting that Meridian Global had already paused all scheduled payments on its pending commitments to the foundation. Bloomberg ran a devastating headline: "Imani Wallace stays silent as Sterling Foundation teeters on brink of collapse." On CNN, an analyst was replaying the clip of Victoria's disastrous press conference, now juxtaposed with footage of panicked-looking investors leaving the gala early. The room descended into chaos. Some board members demanded Victoria embark on a public apology tour. Others, more realistic, demanded her immediate resignation. A few, the oldest and most out of touch, still clung desperately to denial. Victoria slammed her hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "I will not bow to this public humiliation. If we give her this, she will own us." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes locking with Victoria's. "Victoria," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She already does. She just hasn't collected yet." Meanwhile, across town, Imani sat in her sun-drenched townhouse office, the morning light painting the walls in strokes of gold. David scrolled through his phone, reading the headlines aloud. "Victoria's board is fracturing. Donors are officially backing out in droves. That European bank has formally frozen their credit lines. The panic is real." Imani nodded, as calm as ever, taking a sip of her tea. "Panic teaches lessons much faster than policy, David. Let them learn." By that afternoon, the dominoes were falling faster than anyone could count. Two of the foundation's other major donors issued public statements distancing themselves from the organization, citing a Crisis in Leadership. A luxury car brand that had sponsored the gala for a decade publicly pulled its sponsorship from all future events. Staff members, fearing for their jobs, began leaking anonymous accounts to reporters, tales of Victoria's long-standing arrogance, of a toxic culture built on exclusion and fear. Victoria's cake stunt, it turned out, was not an isolated moment of madness. It was the symptom of a deep, systemic rot that ran through her entire leadership. Victoria tried to fight back, a cornered animal lashing out. She scheduled more interviews, insisting she was misunderstood, that she had always supported diversity and inclusion. But every word she spoke seemed to ignite more backlash. Clips of her denials went viral again, this time layered with sarcastic captions: misunderstood millions, misunderstood respect. She still doesn't understand a damn thing. Here at Black Legacies, we share these stories because the sound of panic in powerful rooms is not just gossip. It is the sound of broken systems, collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. That evening, an emergency meeting was called with the Sterling Foundation's largest remaining creditors. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Victoria insisted on leading the call, her voice sharp, her tone clipped and defensive. "We have the resources and the reputation to withstand this temporary storm," she declared, her words ringing hollow. But when a banker from Zurich asked her directly if the $900 million from Meridian Global Capital was secure, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second. That hesitation was all they needed to hear. By morning, that creditor had demanded early repayment of their entire loan. Another signaled their intent to sue if the foundation's funding did not materialize as promised. The market smelled blood in the water. Inside the foundation's headquarters, fear had turned into open revolt. A majority of the board members had drafted and signed a letter of no confidence. Staff members were openly updating their resumes and LinkedIn profiles. Donors were not just fleeing, they were demanding their past contributions be returned. Victoria's name, once a golden ticket to prestige and access, now carried the undeniable stench of scandal and failure. And still, Imani Wallace said nothing more. Her silence was a weapon, deliberate and surgical. Every hour she withheld a public statement, the panic deepened. Every day she let them scramble and implode. Their desperation made her ultimate power all the more clear. She had turned restraint into strategy, patience into punishment. By the end of the week, the headlines were screaming of imminent collapse. Wall Street Journal, Whitmore Foundation faces existential crisis as donors and creditors flee. The Guardian, arrogance meets consequence in philanthropy scandal. New York Times, the $900 million mistake that toppled a dynasty. Analysts on cable news spoke of systemic risk, of a cultural reckoning that was long overdue. And everywhere, ordinary people shared the original clip of the cake and the silence, the indelible image of humiliation being transformed in real time into history. Victoria finally cracked. In a desperate, rambling midnight email to her board, she wrote, "We must appeal to her, offer her anything, a public apology, a board seat, anything. She cannot possibly want to destroy us completely." But the board no longer listened to her. One director replied bluntly, his words a final, brutal epitaph for her reign. "She does not need anything from us, Victoria. We already gave her everything she needed the moment you shoved that cake in her face." In her townhouse, Imani looked at David across her large desk. "They will beg soon," she said softly. "But we are not here to collect pleas for mercy. We are here to collect change." And outside, the city buzzed with one inescapable truth. The cake was long gone, but its consequences were only just beginning. The world had waited in suspense for Imani Wallace to finally speak. Weeks had passed since the cake humiliation, and in that deafening silence, she had allowed Victoria Sterling's empire to dismantle itself piece by piece. Donors had abandoned them, creditors had pressed their claims, and regulators had begun to circle. Yet still Imani had said nothing, her strategic restraint amplifying the panic to a fever pitch. It was as if the entire financial and social universe was leaning forward, holding its collective breath, asking one simple question: what will she do? On a crisp, clear Chicago morning, the answer came. The media had gathered at the Meridian Global Capital headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun with a blinding clarity. A swarm of cameras clustered outside the entrance. News anchors spoke into their microphones with the hushed, reverent tones of people who knew they were about to witness history. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of television screens worldwide. Will Imani Wallace pull the $900 million? Inside the vast, minimalist atrium, staff moved with quiet precision. The stage was set with no extravagance, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Sterling Gala. There was only a single podium and a dark blue backdrop embossed with the Meridian logo. Rows of journalists, flown in from around the globe, filled every seat. They clutched their notepads and recorders, afraid to miss a single syllable. At exactly 10:02 a.m., Imani Wallace walked onto the stage. She wore a white suit, cut to absolute perfection, the color of clarity, of finality. The crowd of hardened journalists rose to their feet, not out of protocol, but out of a palpable sense of awe. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply stood at the podium, waited for the room to fall completely silent, and began. Good morning. Her voice was calm, each word perfectly measured, yet it carried an authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. Cameras zoomed in, phones streamed live. Millions of people around the world tuned in from their offices, their classrooms, their living rooms, waiting. Many of you have asked where Meridian Global stands in relation to the Sterling Foundation. You have asked about our commitments, about our principles, and about our silence. Today, I will answer with clarity. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. I believe that respect is not a courtesy. It is a contract. It is the non-negotiable price of entry into every relationship, every partnership, and every transaction. When respect is withheld, so too is trust. And when trust collapses, so does everything that was built upon it. Journalists scribbled frantically, knowing that every line she spoke would be tomorrow's headline. 3 weeks ago, at an event that I helped to fund, I was publicly humiliated. I was humiliated not merely as an individual, but as a symbol of what unchecked arrogance believes it can get away with. The hostess treated dignity as if it were disposable. She assumed silence meant weakness. She assumed presence without a famous pedigree meant servitude. She let the words hang in the air for a beat. But silence is not weakness. It is strategy, and presence is not servitude. It is sovereignty. The hall was so quiet you could hear the rapid-fire click of camera shutters. Imani's gaze was steady, her voice unwavering. Therefore, today, Meridian Global Capital formally withdraws its entire $900 million commitment from the Sterling Foundation, effective immediately. Audible gasps ripped through the crowd, loud enough to be heard clearly on the live streams. Phones buzzed as news alerts exploded across the globe. Some journalists literally jumped from their seats. Headlines were being typed and published in real time. Imani Wallace pulls $900 million, Sterling Foundation collapses. Imani continued, her voice cutting through the shock. This decision is not personal, it is structural. Institutions that fail to uphold basic standards of respect cannot be trusted with resources that are meant to serve our communities. By withdrawing our capital, we are sending a clear and unequivocal message. Respect is not negotiable. We will not subsidize arrogance. She closed the folder in front of her with a quiet, deliberate finality. To those who are rightly concerned about the charitable projects this will affect, let me be clear. Meridian Global will immediately redirect these funds into a new series of initiatives, programs that are built on a foundation of dignity, equity, and inclusion. The work will continue. But it will continue under leaders who understand the intrinsic value of every single person who walks into a room. Reporters shouted questions as she stepped back from the podium. Ms. Wallace, do you consider this revenge? What is your message to Victoria Sterling? Will you ever fund galas like this again? Imani did not answer. She simply turned and walked off the stage, leaving the noise and chaos behind her. Her silence, once again, was louder and more powerful than any words could be. The impact was immediate and cataclysmic. On Wall Street, trading screens tracking companies affiliated with the Sterling Foundation bled red. Stocks of their corporate partners plummeted by as much as 30% within hours. Panicked board members called emergency meetings. The few remaining donors announced they were withdrawing all support. The European bank that had frozen their credit line officially declared the foundation in default of its loan covenants. The Middle Eastern Sovereign Wealth Fund publicly canceled a separate billion-dollar partnership. The media exploded. CNN cut to live coverage, with anchors speaking breathlessly. This is quite possibly the largest single withdrawal of philanthropic funding in modern history, all stemming from a single act of public disrespect. The New York Times ran a massive banner headline, "The 900 million exit." The BBC declared, "The Wallace Doctrine, respect as currency, arrives in America." Celebrities weighed in within minutes. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "And that is how you end arrogance, with 900 million reasons." A retired tennis champion posted, "Power doesn't shout, power withdraws." A best-selling novelist wrote on Instagram, "This was never a story about cake. It's a story about consequence." Their posts reached tens of millions within the hour. Meanwhile, at the Sterling Foundation headquarters, chaos reigned. Staff members were crying in the hallways. Phones rang off the hook with calls from creditors and regulators. Victoria had locked herself in her office. The golden gown from the gala still hung on a mannequin in the corner, a shimmering ghost mocking her. She watched the press conference being replayed on her laptop, her eyes wide with disbelief, her lips trembling. She muttered to herself over and over again, she couldn't. But she had. Her remaining board members barged into her office hours later. Their faces were pale, their voices sharp and stripped of all deference. "It's over, Victoria. She pulled the funding. We're insolvent. We cannot continue under your leadership." Victoria screamed back, a raw, ragged sound. "You can't do this to me. This is my family's foundation. My name is on the building." One director replied, his voice as cold as ice. "Your name can't hold up the building when the money is gone, and your name, Victoria, now represents ruin." By nightfall, television networks were replaying the clip of the confrontation at the gala, side by side with the clip of Imani's announcement. The contrast was brutal and damning. One showed arrogance dripping with frosting. The other showed dignity wrapped in absolute authority. Commentators called it the clearest lesson in modern philanthropy. Respect is wealth, and arrogance is bankruptcy. Communities around the world responded. In business schools, teachers showed both clips. In churches, pastors preached that grace could follow justice, but justice had to come first. In homes, families told their children, "Never dismiss someone based on how they appear. They may hold your entire future in their hands." Victoria's world shrank to nothing. Her family distanced themselves. Museums quietly removed her name from their boards. She was described in the press as a pariah. And through it all, Imani remained composed. She did not gloat. She did not give interviews beyond her statement. She did not mention Victoria's name again. She let the collapse speak for itself. That night, David asked her, "Do you feel satisfied? You ended her empire." Imani shook her head, looking out at the city lights. "I didn't end her, David. She ended herself. I only turned on the lights so the world could see it." As midnight fell, the world had absorbed the lesson. The $900 million was gone from Victoria's grasp, redirected toward causes that would build rather than belittle. Respect had been defended not with anger, but with decisive, overwhelming power. And one truth lingered on every screen, in every headline, in every conversation. Imani Wallace had turned humiliation into history. What began with frosting had ended with fire, and the blaze had consumed everything Victoria Sterling once thought was untouchable. The morning after Imani Wallace withdrew $900 million, the world woke up to a new reality. It wasn't only Victoria Sterling's foundation that trembled, it was the entire ecosystem of philanthropy, finance, and social prestige that had long operated on the assumption that arrogance could pass without consequence. Newspapers carried Imani's face across their front pages, not covered in frosting this time, but illuminated by the calm, resolute determination she had shown at the podium. The New York Times headline read, "The 900 Million Lesson." The Guardian called it, "The Fall of Old Money Pride." On CNBC, anchors spoke with a sense of wonder. This is not just a financial move, this is a cultural reckoning. The markets reacted swiftly. Charitable foundations tied to old inherited wealth saw immediate and sharp drops in donor confidence. Banks began quietly reviewing their lending contracts, inserting new clauses about equity, governance, and public conduct where none had existed before. One analyst on Bloomberg summed it up perfectly. "Every institution in America is asking itself the same question this morning. Could an Imani Wallace withdrawal happen to us?" The panic was not confined to New York and Chicago. In London, the Financial Times declared that the Wallace Doctrine had arrived. Capital now demanded respect as an integral part of its return on investment. In Paris, the leaders of major arts institutions convened emergency meetings to discuss their donor relations policies. In Tokyo, top business schools had already added Imani's speech to their ethics curriculum overnight. And it was not only institutions that shifted. Communities responded with a palpable hunger for change. In classrooms, students debated what respect should truly mean in leadership. In churches, pastors told their congregations, "You cannot buy dignity, you must honor it." In living rooms, families replayed the clip of Imani saying, "Respect is not a courtesy, it is a contract," and nodded as if this phrase had always been an unspoken truth. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling hid behind the closed doors of her penthouse. Her scarlet suit, once a symbol of defiance, now hung unused in her closet. Donors fled her name as though it were contagious. Museums where her family had their names on entire wings for generations quietly, and without announcement, removed them. Former allies and friends distanced themselves, claiming they had never condoned her arrogance. But the world was no longer talking about Victoria. The world was talking about what came next. Imani did not spend her days celebrating the collapse. She spent them building its replacement. Within 48 hours of her announcement, she revealed that the withdrawn funds would seed a new, groundbreaking initiative, the Wallace Fellowship for Equity and Leadership. Applications opened globally. Within a single week, the website had received thousands of applications from young women from Lagos to Los Angeles, from Mumbai to Miami, all of them brilliant, all of them ambitious, and all of them eager to become part of a program that promised not just funding, but mentorship, networks, and above all, dignity. Reporters asked if this was about revenge. Imani answered softly in a rare statement. It was never about revenge. It is about building a future where arrogance can no longer cancel dignity. Her words spread as quickly and as powerfully as her silence had before. Industry leaders scrambled to keep pace. A major American bank announced mandatory respect audits for its high-net-worth clients. A global tech giant pledged $50 million toward new equity initiatives, explicitly citing Imani's move as their inspiration. Even the United Nations issued a statement calling her decision a pivotal moment for accountability in global finance. Commentators noted that it took one woman's composure to push through reforms that decades of policy and activism had failed to enforce. Still, a backlash stirred in some dark corners. On conservative talk shows, pundits sneered. So now one woman can decide which institutions get to live or die? Others dismissed it as mere political theater. But those voices were quickly drowned out by the market itself. Numbers do not argue. $900 million withdrawn wasn't theater. It was collapse. And collapse does not respect excuses or political opinions. Here at Black Legacies, we share these moments because they prove that when a Black woman defends her dignity, she doesn't just protect herself. She rewrites the rules of the game for everyone. The ripple effects grew, becoming truly global. In Brazil, activists cited Imani's move as a precedent in their fight against discriminatory hiring practices in public banks. In South Africa, a university launched a new program on financial ethics, naming her case study the Wallace Standard. In the Canadian Parliament, a debate began about inserting stronger accountability clauses into the laws governing charitable institutions. The cake that had once been a tool to humiliate Imani had become the batter that was baking reform across continents. David observed it all with awe. One evening, he told her, "You've become more than a leader, Imani. You're a symbol." Imani shook her head, her gaze fixed on the applications piled high on her desk. "Symbols fade, David. Systems last. We are building systems." She pointed to the stack of papers. Every one of these applications is proof that legacy is bigger than collapse. By the second week, industry journals had stopped writing about the fall of Victoria Sterling. They were now writing about the rise of a new order. The Harvard Business Review published a widely read article titled "The Wallace Doctrine: Respect as Risk Management." The Wall Street Journal wrote, "Investors now demanding dignity clauses in funding agreements." At the World Economic Forum in Davos, world leaders quoted her speech. And in the quiet of her office, Imani drafted the plans for the next phase, a phase that would embed respect not as a matter of charity, but as a non-negotiable requirement of doing business. Justice had been served. But now, systemic change had taken root. The humiliation had sparked panic. The panic had sparked reform, and reform was now rewriting contracts, policies, and culture. The question was no longer whether Victoria would survive. She was already gone, a ghost of a forgotten era. The question now was how long the world could resist the tide of accountability Imani had unleashed. And as industry after industry began to bend to this new reality, one truth remained inescapable. The $900 million withdrawal was never just about one woman or one cake. It was about proving that exclusion, arrogance, and disrespect could no longer be allowed to fund the future. The collapse of the Sterling Foundation was no longer a matter of speculation. By the time the third week closed, the institution that had once defined Chicago's philanthropic season was on life support, its assets being frozen and seized by creditors. Headlines spoke of insolvency, lawsuits, and federal investigations. But the world was no longer just watching the numbers. It was watching Charlotte Whitmore herself. She had been silent for days, her once commanding presence erased from society pages, her once endless stream of invitations having vanished from her calendar. When she finally emerged, it was not at a gala or on a red carpet, but on the cold, unforgiving steps of the county courthouse. Cameras swarmed as she stepped from a black sedan, her face pale and drawn, her hair pulled back into a severe, unfamiliar bun. She tried to keep her chin held high, that last vestige of her ingrained arrogance, but her eyes darted nervously under the crush of microphones. "Ms. Sterling!" reporters shouted, their questions a barrage of accusations. "What do you say to the allegations of misuse of funds? Do you admit to gross negligence? Do you regret humiliating Imani Wallace?" She pressed her lips together, gave no answer, and walked briskly inside the building, the sound of the heavy doors closing behind her like the slamming of a prison gate. Inside those walls, the real reckoning began. Regulators presented evidence, loan agreements tied directly to Meridian Global's commitments, board minutes showing a reckless over-reliance on a single donor, emails in which Victoria had dismissed the board's concerns with her characteristic disdain. Her arrogance, once hidden behind a veil of charm, was now preserved in writing, a permanent record of her own undoing. Attorneys for the creditors filed motions demanding immediate repayment, pointing to her reckless public statements as the direct trigger for the foundation's collapse. The judges listened, their faces impassive. For the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling stood in a room where her name carried no weight, no protection. At the same time, public opinion turned merciless. The same society magazines that had once fawned over her golden gowns and flawless hosting now ran exposés on her cruelty. Former staffers, now emboldened, told stories of years of humiliation, of being treated like servants at events meant to celebrate generosity. Donors confessed that they had long endured her arrogance because of the Sterling legacy, but now wished they had spoken up sooner. The frosting that had been smeared on Imani's gown had become an indelible stain on Victoria's reputation, a stain that could never be washed out. Justice unfolded, layer by brutal layer. The Foundation's Board of Trustees, under immense pressure, voted unanimously to remove her from her leadership position, permanently. Her official portrait, unveiled just a year ago in the Foundation's grand lobby, was quietly taken down and put into storage. Museums and opera houses, where her family's name had glowed in gold letters on donor walls, scrubbed them clean. Other charities refused her personal checks. The city that had once bowed to the Sterling name now turned its back on her completely. Victoria raged in private. She threw crystal glasses against marble floors, screaming at aides who no longer answered her calls. She called donors who sent her directly to voicemail. She begged family members, who coolly declined to intervene. Pride had been her armor for her entire life, but now it was a lead weight, dragging her deeper and deeper into disgrace. Meanwhile, Imani Wallace remained silent on the subject of Victoria. She gave no interviews mentioning her by name, made no public statements about her downfall. Her restraint was deliberate, a final masterstroke. The story was no longer about Victoria. It was about consequence. As Imani told her team one evening, justice is not about pointing a finger at a fallen person. It is about proving to the world what it will no longer accept. The public saw the difference. Paparazzi photos captured Victoria screaming at a valet in the street. Grainy cell phone videos showed her storming out of board meetings. Those clips were played side by side with images of Imani standing calmly at global summits, hands folded, speaking about the infrastructure of dignity. One woman embodied collapse. The other embodied command. The contrast was its own trial, and the jury of public opinion was unanimous. The financial cost was staggering. By the end of the fiscal quarter, the Sterling Foundation's assets had shrunk by over 70%. properties were sold off at a loss. Staff were dismissed. Contracts were broken. Creditors seized bank accounts. Investigators uncovered evidence of mismanagement so egregious it bordered on fraud. Victoria's personal fortune evaporated in legal fees and settlements. Her magnificent mansion on the lake, once the site of glittering galas, went dark, the iron gates chained shut. But the greater cost was invisible: her name. Once synonymous with prestige, it became cultural shorthand for arrogance. Talk show hosts used her story as a punchline. Business schools taught her downfall as a cautionary case study. Parents told their children, "Don't be a sterling." And in the hushed whispers of high society, her name was no longer used to open doors, but to close them. The final crushing blow came when the state attorney general announced the filing of civil charges for breach of fiduciary duty. The press gathered in a frenzy. The announcement was stark and brutal. Victoria Sterling failed not only her donors, but the public trust. She placed her personal arrogance above her fiscal accountability. Today, that arrogance meets its consequence. The statement was replayed endlessly, a mantra of modern justice. That night, Victoria sat alone in her darkened penthouse, staring out at the Chicago skyline. Once, those twinkling lights had looked like jewels that belonged to her. Now they looked like 1,000 eyes watching her unravel. She whispered into the empty room, "It was just a cake." But even she no longer believed it. She knew the truth. It had never been about the cake. It had been about respect, and she had destroyed herself by refusing to give it. Across town, Imani was preparing for the launch of the next class of Wallace Fellows. When David asked her if she felt vindicated, she shook her head. "Vindication is for those who seek revenge. I seek remembrance. The real justice is not that Victoria Sterling lost her foundation. It's that an entire generation of future leaders has now learned what respect costs." And the world had learned. Justice had been served not by vengeance, but by consequence. Victoria Sterling was gone, not by fire or fury, but by the quiet, patient, and crushing weight of truth. Her empire had crumbled, her reputation had vanished, her legacy had been inverted. She had tried to smash a cake into another woman's dignity. Instead, the world had smashed her name into the warning pages of history. And so the arc of the universe had bent, not toward humiliation, but toward justice. What did you think of Imani's final move? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe dignity is the ultimate power. We'll see you next time on Black Legacies, where we prove that our stories change the world.